Normally, the smell of cheap, stale coffee and burnt diesel fades into the background, but tonight the stench is suffocating. Parked under the flickering sodium light, a grey sedan sits with its engine running, and it's been running for an hour. At 22, walking to your car alone at 2 a.m. turns the world from a place into a trap. This isn't a fairy tale, though. Her knight rode a stripped-down Harley, wore a patched leather vest, and brought 200 of his closest friends. The diner smelled like industrial bleach and old grease, a scent that embedded itself into the cuticles, impossible to scrub away no matter how hard the bristle brush was applied. It was 1:45 a.m. The waitress Chloe wiped down counterstool number 4. Her feet were throbbing, a dull, rhythmic ache radiating from her arches straight up to her lower back. She just wanted to go to sleep. She dumped the dirty rag into the grey plastic bus tub. The bell above the door hadn't chimed in over 40 minutes, but there was still one customer left. He sat in the back corner booth. He had been there since 11. He hadn't ordered food, just a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold, forming that disgusting iridescent film on the top. He wore a grey fleece zip-up. His hair was thinning, combed neatly over his scalp. He looked like an accountant. He looked like nobody. And he hadn't taken his eyes off Chloe for almost 3 hours. She tried to rationalize it. I'm just exhausted. I'm being a paranoid bitch. It was the late shift. You get weirdos, the highway drifters, the insomniacs, the guys who didn't want to go home to their wives. You learn to tune them out. But every time she turned her back to refill the sugar dispensers, she could feel the weight of his stare. It was heavy, a physical pressure between her shoulder blades. "Hey, buddy!" Dave, the line cook, yelled from the kitchen pass, scraping down the flat-top grill, the metal spatula screeching against the steel. "We're closing the registers." The guy in the fleece didn't say anything. He just stood up, left a crumpled $1 bill on the Formica table, and walked out. The door chimed. Chloe let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her shoulders dropped. See? Just a weirdo. Nothing to it. At 2:15 a.m., Dave locked the front doors. Chloe grabbed her worn canvas jacket, clocked out, and walked out the back emergency exit into the alley. The air was freezing, biting through her thin uniform shirt. The gravel crunched loudly under her cheap sneakers. Her car, a dented Honda Civic, was parked under the single working halogen bulb behind the dumpsters. She dug her keys out of her pocket. They jingled, the sound sharp, and entirely too loud in the dead quiet of the night. Then she heard it. An engine turning over. It wasn't a loud engine. It was the quiet, purring hum of a standard 4-cylinder. She paused, the key halfway into the door lock, and looked over the roof of her car. Parked at the far edge of the lot, idling with the headlights off, was a grey sedan. Her stomach plummeted. A cold sweat broke out along her hairline. The rational part of her brain screamed at her to go back inside, to bang on the metal door until Dave opened it. But the other part of her brain, the part shaped by a society that taught women not to make a scene, told her to just get in the car and drive. He's probably just checking his phone before he hits the highway. She got in and locked the doors immediately. Her hands were shaking so badly she scratched the steering column, trying to insert the ignition key. The engine sputtered to life. She threw it into drive and peeled out of the lot, tires slipping briefly on the loose gravel. She turned right onto County Road 9. The road was a straight, desolate black ribbon cutting through dense pine woods. No streetlights, just the bright beams of her Honda cutting through the absolute dark. She looked in her rearview mirror. 2 headlights flicked on behind her. They were about 100 yards back. She sped up, pushing the needle to 65. The headlights kept pace. She slowed down to 40. The headlights slowed down. Oh God, The air in the car felt thin. She couldn't breathe. She fumbled for her phone in the passenger seat, keeping one eye on the road and one on the mirror. The battery icon blinked a hollow red. 4%. Call the cops, she thought. But what could she tell them? There's a car behind me. She didn't have a license plate. She was on a dark county road with no cross streets for 10 miles. If she pulled over to wait for a squad car, she would be a sitting duck. If she kept driving, her gas light was going to come on. She needed a public place. She needed lights. Up ahead, a tall, illuminated sign pierced the tree line, a massive 24-hour truck stop and gas station. It was an island of blinding fluorescent light in an ocean of black. She slammed her foot on the gas, the little engine whining in protest, and swerved into the entrance, barely hitting the brakes. She circled the pumps once and pulled up to the convenience store storefront. She threw the car in park and kept the engine running. She looked in the mirror. The grey sedan pulled into the lot. It didn't go to the pumps. It didn't park near the store. It crawled to a stop at the very edge of the concrete, near the air compressor. The engine idled. The headlights cut off. He was just going to wait. He knew she couldn't stay in the car forever. Chloe sat in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were stark white. The heater was blasting, blowing dry, stale air into her face. But she was shivering violently. She stared at the grey sedan through the smeary glass of her side mirror. The driver's side window rolled down a crack. A faint curl of cigarette smoke drifted out into the cold night air. The man wasn't in a rush. That was the most terrifying part. There was no frantic energy to him. He was patient. He was hunting. Her phone vibrated on the passenger seat, buzzing against some loose change. 1% battery. It died before she could even pick it up, the screen turning black and reflecting her own terrified, pale face back at her. She looked at the convenience store. The glass doors were lit up, but there was no cashier in sight. Probably in the back stocking the coolers. The lot was otherwise empty. Just her, the stalker, and a massive expanse of oil-stained concrete. Then she felt it before she heard it. A deep, rhythmic thumping vibrated through the floorboards of her car. It was a mechanical, guttural sound. A few seconds later, the roar of a heavy engine shattered the silence of the truck stop. A motorcycle pulled off the highway and banked sharply into the lot. It was a massive, stripped-down Harley-Davidson, flat black, the chrome exhaust pipes glinting under the canopy lights. The rider didn't pull up to the store. He rolled straight to the high-octane pump right in front of Chloe's car. He kicked the stand down. The engine cut off, leaving a ringing silence in its wake, followed immediately by the sharp tink-tink-tink of cooling metal. He stepped off the bike. He was a mountain of a man, late 50s, maybe older. He wore heavy denim, scuffed steel-toe boots, and a thick leather vest over a black hoodie. The vest looked ancient, the leather worn soft and grey at the edges. On the back of the vest, unmistakable even to someone who knew nothing about motorcycle clubs, was a large embroidered patch, a winged skull. The words Hell's Angels arched across the top, New York across the bottom. Chloe's breath hitched. The cops always told you to avoid these guys. The news called them a syndicate, an organized crime ring. They were supposed to be dangerous. She looked back at the grey sedan. The driver's door was opening. A dark, unremarkable shoe stepped out onto the pavement. The man in the fleece was getting out. Panic, hot and sour, rose in her throat. She had a choice to make, and she had exactly 5 seconds to make it. Wait for the man in the fleece, the guy who had been watching her for 3 hours and followed her into the middle of nowhere. Or take her chances with the outlaw biker currently unscrewing the gas cap of his Harley. She didn't think. She reacted. She unlocked her door, shoved it open, and practically fell out of the car. Her legs felt like lead. The cold air hit her like a slap. She walked toward the gas pumps. The biker was swiping a credit card. Up close, the smell of him was overwhelming. Unburned high-test gasoline, hot engine oil, stale Marlboro Reds, and old rain-soaked leather. He had a thick grey beard and a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jawline, pulling the skin taut. He didn't look at her as she approached. He just lifted the heavy black nozzle from the pump. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was pathetic. It came out as a thin, trembling whisper, a child's voice. She hated it. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to stand taller, though her knees were knocking together. "Excuse me," she said, louder this time. He stopped. He didn't put the nozzle in the tank. He slowly turned his head. His eyes were pale blue, entirely flat and devoid of warmth. It wasn't a friendly look. It was the look of a man who was used to dealing with problems and was trying to figure out if she was one of them. "What?" he grunted. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together. Chloe opened her mouth, but the words got stuck. The absurdity of it all crushed her. What was she doing? Asking a Hell's Angel for help? He was going to laugh at her. He was going to tell her to get lost. The tears she had been fighting back for the last 20 miles suddenly spilled over. She felt the hot streak of salt water track through the cheap foundation on her cheek. She looked messy, weak, and hysterical. She pointed a shaking finger toward the edge of the lot. "There's a guy," she managed to choke out, her chest heaving. "In that grey car. He was at my work. He waited for me. He followed me here. He's getting out of his car." The biker didn't flinch. He didn't look at her with pity. He didn't offer a reassuring smile or tell her it was going to be okay. Instead, his pale blue eyes slowly tracked away from her face, following the direction of her trembling finger. He looked past her Honda, across the expanse of concrete, straight at the grey sedan. The man in the fleece had closed his car door. He was walking toward them. He had that feigned, casual stride of someone pretending they were just stretching their legs, but his eyes were locked entirely on Chloe. Then he noticed the biker looking at him. The stalker froze. It was subtle, just a slight hesitation in his step, a tightening of his shoulders. He was about 50 feet away, illuminated by the harsh, white glare of the parking lot lights. The biker, his cut said his road name was Drake on a small rectangular patch over his heart, didn't yell. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't do anything theatrical. Drake slowly turned back to the pump. He placed the heavy black nozzle back into its cradle with a deliberate, metallic clank. He let his arms hang at his sides. He just stood there, his massive frame blocking the stalker's line of sight to Chloe. He stared the man down. The silence between them was suffocating. It wasn't just a look, it was a physical barrier. The man in the fleece shifted his weight. He shoved his hands into his pockets. He broke eye contact, suddenly intensely interested in the ice machine sitting outside the convenience store doors. He changed his trajectory, walking a wide, awkward arc away from them and slipping inside the brightly lit store. Chloe let out a ragged gasp, grabbing the edge of Drake's motorcycle seat to keep her balance. Her legs felt like water. He went inside," she stammered, wiping the snot from her nose with the back of her sleeve. She felt entirely stripped of her dignity. "But he'll wait. He's going to wait until you leave. I don't have my phone. It's dead. I can't call anyone." Drake looked back at her. The harshness in his face hadn't faded, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He reached inside the inner pocket of his heavy leather vest. Chloe flinched, her paranoid brain half expecting a gun, but he pulled out a thick, industrial-looking smartphone with a cracked screen. He didn't offer it to her. He unlocked it with a calloused, grease-stained thumb and pressed a single button. He held it to his ear. He didn't take his eyes off the convenience store doors. "Yeah, it's Drake," he said into the phone. His voice didn't rise above a low, gravelly rumble. I'm at the Flying J out on County 9. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Yeah, hold off on the run to the clubhouse. Got a situation. Drake's pale eyes flicked down to Chloe for a fraction of a second, taking in her cheap diner uniform, her shaking hands, the absolute terror still radiating off her. Got a rat sniffing around a stray kid. Yeah, a civilian. Chloe swallowed hard. A stray kid. She felt a bizarre mix of deep offense and overwhelming gratitude. Grey sedan. Shitty 4-door. Guys in the store right now. Drake scratched his grey beard, the sound of stubble rasping against his knuckles, loud in the quiet night. Yeah. Bring whoever is still at the bar. He pulled the phone away from his ear and shoved it back into his vest. He turned to face her fully. Get back in your car, Drake said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, flat and devoid of emotion. But, get in the car, he repeated, his tone dropping an octave. Lock the doors. Keep your foot on the brake so I know you ain't in park. Don't look at him. You look at me. Chloe didn't argue. She practically scrambled backward, yanking the door of her Civic open and collapsing into the driver's seat. She slammed the door shut, hitting the lock button so hard her thumb bruised. She shoved the gear shift into drive and kept her foot firmly planted on the brake pedal. Through the windshield, she watched Drake. He walked away from the pumps and stepped up onto the concrete curb directly in front of her car. He crossed his massive arms over his chest. He planted his steel-toed boots shoulder-width apart. He faced the glass doors of the convenience store. A few minutes later, the automatic doors slid open. The man in the fleece walked out. He had a small bag of chips in his hand, a prop, an excuse to have gone inside. He took 2 steps onto the pavement and stopped. He looked at her car. Then he looked at the giant man in leather standing between him and Chloe. Drake didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at the man with a cold, dead-eyed intensity that made the hair on Chloe's own arms stand up. The message was clear. I know what you are, and you aren't getting past me. The stalker stood there for a long, agonizing moment. Chloe could see the cogs turning in his head. He was trying to figure out if the biker was her boyfriend, her father, or just a stranger playing hero. He was calculating the risk. He decided it wasn't worth it. Not with one biker. The man in the fleece sneered, a quick, ugly curling of his lip. He dropped the bag of chips on the ground, turned on his heel, and walked briskly toward his grey sedan. A wave of relief, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over her. He's leaving. She watched him get into his car. She watched the taillights flare red. She waited for him to put it in reverse and drive away. But he didn't. He put the car in reverse, backed out of the space, and then slowly drove to the far side of the gas station canopy. He parked again. He cut his headlights. Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs. He wasn't leaving. He realized there was only one biker. He realized Drake would eventually have to get on his Harley and drive away. The stalker had nothing but time. She looked at Drake. She expected him to throw his hands up, to get back on his bike, to leave her to her fate. He had done his part. He had scared the guy off temporarily. But Drake didn't move toward his motorcycle. He slowly pulled a pack of Marlboros from his chest pocket. He tapped a cigarette out, placed it between his lips, and cupped his hands to light it with a battered Zippo. The flame illuminated his scarred face for a second. He took a deep drag, the cherry of the cigarette glowing bright orange in the dark. He exhaled a long plume of grey smoke into the freezing air. He looked at the dark silhouette of the grey sedan parked across the lot. And then, Drake smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a terrifying, jagged showing of teeth. It was the smile of a wolf that had just realized the sheep had walked willingly into the slaughterhouse. Because over the sound of her idling engine, over the hum of the fluorescent lights, she heard something else. It started as a low, distant hum, like thunder rolling in from the valley. She looked out toward County Road 9. The pitch-black tree line was suddenly glowing. It wasn't the stark white of streetlights. It was a warm, sweeping yellow. The hum grew louder. It turned into a rumble. The concrete beneath her tires began to vibrate again, but this time it was 100 times stronger. Dozens of headlights crested the hill, then dozens more. A wall of noise hit the truck stop. It was deafening. It was the raw, unadulterated roar of American iron and hot exhaust. It wasn't one motorcycle, it wasn't 10. A massive column of Hell's Angels came pouring off the highway, a sea of black leather, chrome, and blinding headlights flooding into the truck stop. They didn't just pull in. They swarmed. They circled the pumps. They blocked the exits. And then, with the precision of a military unit, they began to encircle the grey sedan. The noise wasn't just loud. It had physical weight. It pressed against the thin glass of the Honda's windshield, rattling the loose plastic trim of the dashboard. It vibrated up through the worn floor mats, a deep, percussive pounding that synced perfectly with Chloe's racing heart. She sat paralyzed, her foot clamped down on the brake pedal, watching the darkness of the county road shatter. They didn't just drive into the parking lot. They flooded it. It was a mechanical tide of gleaming chrome, matte black paint, and glaring halogen headlights. 200 motorcycles, maybe more, roared off the highway and into the sterile white glow of the Flying J. The smell hit her even through the closed vents, a thick, choking mixture of unburnt, high-octane fuel, hot engine oil, and the sharp, acidic tang of burnt rubber. It was absolute chaos, but beneath the deafening roar, there was a terrifying militaristic precision. They didn't park. They moved in formations. A heavy-set man on a blood-red chopper, his cut reading Sergeant-at-Arms, threw a thick, leather-clad arm up, gesturing toward the exit ramps. A dozen bikers immediately peeled off the main column, their rear tires sliding on the loose gravel before catching traction. They parked their heavy machines horizontally across the entrances and exits, killing the engines and crossing their arms. Nobody was coming into the truck stop. And nobody was leaving. The main body of the swarm flowed around the gas pumps, splitting into two distinct rivers of heavy machinery. They bypassed the little dented Civic completely, leaving a wide, respectful berth. Instead, their headlights all converged on a single point in the darkness at the edge of the lot. The grey sedan. Chloe pressed her forehead against the cold glass of her driver's window, her breath fogging the pane. Through the smear of condensation, she watched the trap snap shut. The Stalker had tried to turn his headlights on when the first wave hit the lot. She saw the weak yellow beams flick on, illuminating the side of a parked semi-truck. She saw his brake lights flash a frantic, staccato rhythm as he threw the car into drive, desperately looking for a gap. There were no gaps. The bikers swarmed the sedan. They didn't hit the car. They didn't scream. They just packed in, row after row, side by side, pulling their front tires within inches of the cheap plastic bumpers. The rumble of 200 idling V-twin engines was a physical assault. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the heat rising off the exhaust pipes. They boxed him in a perfect, suffocating square. 3 rows deep on all sides, a wall of metal, leather, and hard men. Drake hadn't moved from his spot on the curb. He stood entirely still, his cigarette burning down to the filter, just watching the mechanical ballet unfold. He looked like an orchestra conductor who didn't even need to raise his baton to make the music play. A man on a blacked-out Decina, wearing a beanie pulled down low over his ears, rolled to a stop right next to Drake. He didn't cut the engine. He leaned over, shouting something over the roar of the exhaust. Drake nodded once, a sharp, decisive jerk of his chin. He finally took a step off the curb. Drake flicked his cigarette butt onto the concrete, the sparks scattering in a brief, bright shower. He began to walk towards the sea of motorcycles. He didn't rush. His steel-toed boots struck the pavement with a slow, heavy, deliberate cadence. As he approached the perimeter of the bikes, the wall parted. It was entirely seamless. The men on the outer edge backed their heavy bikes up, feet walking the pavement backward, creating a narrow aisle for Drake to walk through. The aisle led directly to the driver's side door of the grey sedan. Chloe's stomach churned, a sour, acidic wave of nausea rolling through her. The adrenaline, which had kept her hyper-focused and frantic for the last 20 minutes, was starting to curdle. Her hands were shaking so violently that she had to tuck them under her thighs to keep from hitting the steering wheel. She was safe. She knew she was safe. But watching this, watching a highly organized syndicate of outlaws trap a man in a parking lot at 2 a.m, awoke a different, more primal kind of fear. She was looking at the wolves. They were just hunting a smaller predator. Drake reached the center of the mechanical ring. He stood 2 feet from the driver's side door of the grey sedan. Then he raised his right hand. He didn't shout. He just closed his fist. The silence that followed was more violent than the noise. In perfect unison, 200 men hit their kill switches. The deafening, rib-rattling roar of the engines died instantly, leaving behind a ringing, heavy vacuum. The only sounds left were the sharp tink-tink-tink of cooling chrome and the low, distant hum of the highway. The sudden quiet was suffocating. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the parking lot. From her car, 50 yards away, Chloe could see the man in the fleece. The harsh, overhead halogen lights of the truck stop illuminated the inside of his car perfectly. He was trapped in a glass display case. He was plastered against the center console, leaning as far away from the driver's window as the seatbelt would allow. His hands were raised, palms out, pressing against the empty air, as if that could somehow push back the mountain of leather and scowling faces surrounding him. His mouth was moving rapidly, a frantic, pathetic babbling that Chloe couldn't hear, but she could read the raw, liquid panic in his posture. This was the man who had sat in the diner for 3 hours, the man who had stared a hole through her spine, the man who had patiently waited in the dark, intending to follow a 22-year-old girl down an empty black road. He didn't look like a hunter anymore. He looked like a rat cornered in a basement. Drake leaned forward. He planted both of his large, calloused hands on the roof of the grey sedan. The car's suspension groaned slightly under his weight. He lowered his face until it was mere inches from the driver's side window. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't try the door handle. He knew it was locked, and breaking the glass would mean bringing the cops into it. Hell's Angels didn't survive for decades by being stupid. They survived by understanding exactly how much terror they could inflict without leaving a mark. Drake raised one hand and tapped his knuckle against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound carried across the quiet lot. It was slow, rhythmic. A heavy silver skull ring clicking against the safety glass. The stalker flinched so violently he hit his head against the passenger seat headrest. He scrambled to roll down the window, his trembling fingers fumbling with the electronic switches. The glass slid down exactly 1 inch. No more. Chloe couldn't hear what Drake said. His voice was a low, guttural rumble, perfectly pitched so that only the man inside the car could hear it. But she watched the stalker's face. The man's skin went from a flushed, panicked red to a sickening, translucent grey. He nodded frantically, his head bobbing up and down in rapid, jerky motions. He was sobbing. She could see the wet sheen of tears reflecting the overhead lights, his face contorted in absolute, abject terror. A younger biker, maybe 30, standing a few feet behind Drake, leaned over and spat a thick wad of tobacco juice onto the hood of the sedan. It hit the metal with a wet smack. The stalker didn't even look at it. He kept his eyes locked on Drake, terrified to look away. Drake spoke for maybe 30 seconds. It was a short, brutally efficient conversation. Then Drake stood up straight. He took a step back from the car. He didn't look back at the man in the fleece. He turned his head and looked across the sea of motorcycles directly at Chloe's Honda. Even from 50 yards away, she felt the weight of those pale blue eyes. He gave her a single, slow nod. It was over. Drake raised his hand again and made a sweeping, circular motion with his index finger. The parking lot exploded back into life. 200 engines cranked over almost simultaneously, the roar hitting Chloe like a physical blow once again. The air filled with the sharp stench of exhaust. The wall of metal broke. The bikers forming the front line kicked their machines into gear and rolled forward, peeling away from the grey sedan in pairs. They left a wide, open corridor leading straight toward the highway exit. The Stalker didn't hesitate. His car lurched forward, the tires squealing loudly as he punched the gas. He tore through the opening, nearly swiping a gas pump in his panic. He didn't look back. He blew right through the stop sign at the end of the exit ramp, turned left onto the dark county road, and accelerated until his tail lights were nothing but distant, fading red pinpricks in the black. He was gone. Chloe collapsed against her steering wheel. The tension that had kept her spine rigid snapped. Her chest heaved, pulling in jagged, ragged breaths of stale, heater-warmed air. The tears, which had been frozen by shock, finally broke loose. She pressed her face into the worn fabric of her sleeves, letting out a choked, ugly sound. She was crying from relief. She was crying from the pure, unadulterated exhaustion of the late shift, colliding with the terror of almost becoming a statistic. And strangely, she was crying because of the sheer, surreal absurdity of what had just happened. A biker gang just saved her life. A sharp double tap on her passenger side window made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She twisted around. A man was standing there. He wasn't Drake. He was younger, with a thick black beard and a heavy leather jacket covered in road dirt. He was straddling a massive touring bike, his boots planted on the concrete. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the power window switch. He pointed to his own ear, then made a rolling motion with his hand. "Roll it down." She cracked the window 2 inches. The smell of exhaust poured into the cabin, thick and metallic. "Drake says you're clear, sweetheart." The biker yelled over the idle of his engine. His voice was gruff, but there was a strange, almost paternal gentleness to the way he looked at her tear-streaked face. "Rat's running south. He won't be back. Drake made sure he knows what happens if his car is ever seen in this zip code again." Chloe swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. It came out as a raspy croak. "Thank you. Thank you. Tell him thank you." The biker offered a grim half-smile. "Don't mention it. Look, you're shaking like a leaf. You got far to go?" About 20 minutes." She stuttered. "North, into town." He nodded, looking over his shoulder. The mass of motorcycles was already beginning to thin out, small groups peeling off and heading back toward the highway. But a solid core of about 15 bikes remained, idling near the gas pumps. "All right, put it in gear," he ordered. "We ain't leaving a stray out here to drive home alone. You lead. We'll follow." He didn't wait for an answer. He backed his heavy bike away from her window, kicked it into gear, and rolled toward the exit, signaling the others. Chloe sat there for a second, her brain struggling to process the shift in reality. 10 minutes ago, she was hunted. Now she was being given a presidential escort by the Hells Angels. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing cheap mascara into the skin beneath her eyes. She put the car in drive, eased her foot off the brake, and rolled slowly toward the exit. As she pulled out onto County Road 9, the dark night swallowed her little car. But she wasn't alone. 4 heavy motorcycles pulled out ahead of her, forming a diamond wedge. They settled into a steady 45 miles per hour, their bright headlights cutting a wide, safe path through the dense pine woods. She looked in her rearview mirror. The mirror that had shown her the terrifying, creeping headlights of the grey sedan just half an hour ago. Now the mirror was filled with a wall of chrome and blinding light. 8 more bikers were fanned out behind her, riding staggered in the lane. 2 more rode parallel to her rear bumper, boxing her in completely. The drive home was deeply surreal. It was a sensory isolation chamber, surrounded by the deafening rhythmic thrum of heavy engines. The vibration of their exhausts matched the thumping of her own pulse. The cold air seeping through her cracked window smelled entirely of burning gasoline and hot leather. Every time a car approached from the opposite direction, the lead bikers would shift slightly toward the center line, forcing the oncoming traffic to hug the shoulder. Nobody messed with a pack of Hell's Angels in the middle of the night. They owned the road. It was a fleeting, dizzying taste of absolute power and total security. Chloe didn't feel weak anymore. She didn't feel like prey. Nestled perfectly in the center of that roaring formation, she felt completely untouchable. They drove for 20 minutes. They passed the dark, sleeping houses on the outskirts of town. They passed the blinking yellow traffic light near the high school. Finally, she signaled right, turning onto her narrow, tree-lined street. The massive escort didn't break formation. They turned with her, the rumbling of 15 heavy engines echoing off the vinyl siding of the suburban houses. Porch lights flicked on. She could see the silhouettes of her neighbors peering out from behind their curtains, waking up to the sound of an outlaw motorcycle club rolling slowly down their quiet street at 3 a.m. She pulled into the cracked asphalt driveway of her tiny rented duplex. She put the car in park and shut off the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was startling. The bikers didn't pull into the driveway. They lined up along the curb, their engines still idling, a low, menacing purr that vibrated the windows of her house. She sat in the dark for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She knew she needed to go inside. She knew she needed to lock the door and sleep for a week, but she didn't want the safety bubble to pop. She unbuckled her seatbelt, opened her car door, and stepped out into the freezing night air. The biker who had spoken to her at the truck stop was parked nearest to her driveway. He watched her as she walked toward her front porch. She stopped on the first wooden step and turned back to look at them. 15 men on massive machines, faceless beneath their helmets and beanies in the dark. She raised her hand, a small, awkward wave, a final pathetic attempt to convey the massive weight of her gratitude. The biker nearest to her nodded once. He reached down and revved his engine, a sharp, deafening bark of raw power. The rest of the pack followed suit. 15 engines revved in unison, a booming, mechanical salute that shook the dead leaves off the oak tree in her front yard. Then, he kicked his bike into gear and rolled away from the curb. The others fell into line seamlessly behind him. Chloe stood on her porch, the cold air biting through her thin jacket, watching the column of red tail lights fade into the suburban darkness. The deep rumble of their exhausts echoed through the neighborhood long after they were gone. She turned her key in the lock, the deadbolt sliding home with a heavy, satisfying click. The house smelled like stale laundry and old carpet. It was quiet. It was empty. But for the first time all night, her hands weren't shaking. The sun didn't rise so much as it bled through the cheap, off-white vinyl blinds of the bedroom window. It was a harsh, unforgiving glare that highlighted the dust motes dancing in the stale air. Chloe hadn't slept. She had just laid there on top of her faded quilt, still wearing the jeans and the cheap canvas jacket she had worn to the diner. Her boots were still on. Her body felt like it had been put through a commercial meat grinder. The adrenaline crash is a physical thing. It doesn't just leave you tired, it strips the marrow from your bones. Every muscle in her back and neck was locked into a rigid, painful knot. Her mouth tasted like copper and old pennies. She rolled over, the mattress springs whining in protest. It was 11 a.m. The silence of the house was aggressive. Last night, the silence had been the thing trying to kill her, before the roar of the exhaust pipes broke it apart. Now it was just the heavy, banal quiet of a Tuesday morning in a cheap duplex, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant, muted groan of a garbage truck grinding down the next block over. She dragged herself into the bathroom. The fluorescent bulb above the sink flickered, casting a sickly greenish pallor over her reflection. She looked exactly like a girl who had spent the night being hunted. The mascara had smeared into deep, bruised-looking hollows under her eyes. Her skin was pale and waxy. There was a faint, grease-like sheen of dried sweat on her forehead. She stripped off the clothes. They smelled like the diner, fryer grease and industrial sanitizer, but beneath that, baked right into the fabric, was the unmistakable stench of high-octane gasoline, heavy exhaust, and burnt rubber. She shoved the clothes into the bottom of a plastic laundry hamper. She didn't want to look at them. The shower water was scalding, but she couldn't get warm. She scrubbed her skin with a rough loofah until it was bright pink and raw, trying to peel off the invisible layer of grime that the man in the fleece had left on her with his eyes. It didn't work. The smell of the diesel exhaust lingered in her nasal cavity, a ghost scent that refused to wash down the drain. She had to go back to work at 3. She had called her manager, a perpetually exhausted woman named Brenda, and begged to be switched off the night shift. She told her she had family issues. She didn't tell her about the grey sedan. She didn't tell her about Drake. Walking out to her dented Honda Civic in the brutal clarity of the afternoon sun felt like stepping onto a different planet. The car looked pathetic. It was just a hunk of scratched metal with a fading clear coat. Last night it had been a fortress, a glass box that barely kept the wolves at bay. She got in. She locked the doors immediately. It was a reflex now. The drive to the diner was agonizing. Every time a car pulled up behind her at a red light, her eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Her chest tightened. She scanned the make and model. Blue Ford, white Toyota, red Nissan. No grey sedans. But the panic didn't care about logic. It sat hot and heavy in the base of her throat, a permanent lump of sour bile. When she pulled into the diner's back lot, Dave the line cook was sitting on an overturned milk crate by the dumpsters, smoking a generic cigarette. "Hey, kid," he mumbled around the filter as she walked past. He looked her up and down. "You look like hell. Late night?" "Something like that," she muttered, pushing through the heavy metal fire door. The diner smelled the same, looked the same. The neon open sign buzzed with that familiar, annoying frequency, but the geography of the room had changed for her. She walked past the counter. She looked at the back corner booth. Booth number 4. It was empty. It had been wiped down. The Formica tabletop gleamed dully under the overhead lights. But to her, it looked radioactive. It looked like a crime scene. She could still see the phantom outline of the man in the grey fleece sitting there, his hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, his eyes tracking her every movement. She grabbed her apron from the break room hook. She tied it around her waist. Her hands were shaking again. Just a slight, barely perceptible tremor in her fingers, but she couldn't stop it. She spent the next 6 hours pouring lukewarm coffee, wiping down sticky syrup spills, and nodding at truck drivers complaining about the price of diesel. It was an exercise in extreme dissociation. She was moving, talking, and working, but she wasn't in her body. She was hovering somewhere near the ceiling, watching a girl pretend she wasn't shattered. Every time the little brass bell above the front door chimed, her breath hitched. Her eyes snapped to the entrance. She was waiting for the fleece jacket. She was waiting for the thinning hair and the dead, patient stare. He never came. At 10 p.m. she clocked out. She didn't wait until closing. She didn't walk out into the dark, alone. Brenda walked her to her car, complaining about the new distributor prices for frozen hash browns. Chloe nodded, mechanically agreeing with her. scanning the perimeter of the parking lot with the frantic intensity of a combat veteran. There were no grey cars. There was no idling engine in the dark. She drove home, taking 3 different detours just to make sure she wasn't being followed. When she finally locked the deadbolt of her duplex, she slid down the back of the door until she was sitting on the cheap carpet. She pulled her knees to her chest and cried until she dry heaved. It wasn't a heroic survival. It was ugly, and it was pathetic, and it was going to take a very long time to fix. 2 weeks passed. The terror didn't leave, but it mutated. It stopped being a sharp, stabbing panic and settled into a low, chronic ache, a persistent hum of hypervigilance. She bought a heavy metal maglite flashlight and kept it on the passenger seat of her car. She started carrying her keys between her knuckles when she walked to the grocery store. She stopped wearing her hair in a ponytail, terrified someone could grab it from behind. The world had unmasked itself, showing her the jagged, predatory teeth hiding just beneath the thin veneer of a polite society. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2:30 p.m., the post-lunch lull. The diner was mostly empty. The air was thick with the smell of burnt toast and pine-scented floor cleaner. Dave was in the back, violently scrubbing down the flat-top grill. Chloe was leaning against the counter, staring blankly at the spinning pie case, watching a sad-looking slice of cherry pie rotate under a yellow light bulb. The brass bell above the door chimed. She didn't flinch as hard as she usually did. She turned around, a fake retail smile plastered on her face, reaching for a laminated menu. The smile died instantly. He didn't look the same in the daylight. That was the first thing that struck her. Last night, under the harsh sodium lights of the truck stop, Drake had looked like a myth. A towering, shadowed figure of leather and violence, a titan forged from exhaust smoke and iron. Here, stepping into the faded, sunlight-streaked diner, he just looked like an aging man. He was wearing the same heavy denim and scuffed steel-toe boots, but he didn't have the leather cut on. He wore a faded black t-shirt that stretched tight across his broad, barrel chest. Without the heavy vest, he looked older. The deep grooves around his mouth and the heavy bags under his pale blue eyes were undeniable in the afternoon light. The scar running down his cheek looked pink and raised, violently out of place among the banal plastic decor of the restaurant. He didn't swagger. He walked with a heavy, slightly arthritic limp. Chloe's heart did a strange, complex stutter. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't exactly comfort either. It was the deeply unsettling realization that her savior was just a guy who probably had back pain and drank too much whiskey. He didn't look around the diner. He walked straight to the counter and sat down on stool number 2. The red vinyl seat groaned under his weight. She stood paralyzed for a second. The menus felt heavy in her hand. She walked over. She didn't offer him a menu. She grabbed a heavy white ceramic mug and the glass carafe of regular coffee. Her hands weren't shaking, but her throat felt tight. She set the mug down in front of him. She poured the coffee. The dark liquid steamed in the sunlight. "Black," he said. His voice was just as she remembered it, a low, gravelly grinding of stones. "I know," she said quietly. He looked up at her, his pale blue eyes locked onto hers. In the daylight, they weren't entirely flat. There was a sharp, calculating intelligence in them, a weariness that went bone deep. He recognized her instantly. He didn't smile, but there was a microscopic shift in his jawline. An acknowledgement. She put the carafe back on the warmer. She stood across the counter from him, wiping an imaginary spot of grease off the formica with a rag. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't suffocating. It was laden with the weight of the truck stop, of the swarm of motorcycles, of the glass box he had put the Stalker in. She had spent 2 weeks wishing she could thank him properly. She had spent 2 weeks imagining this scenario, planning the words she would say, the profound gratitude she would express. But looking at him now, she realized how stupid that was. He didn't want her gratitude. He didn't want a tearful monologue about how he saved her life. To him, she was a stray kid, a civilian. She wasn't part of his world, and he didn't want her to be. "You ain't working nights," he stated. It wasn't a question. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I switched to days." He nodded slowly. He wrapped his massive, calloused hands around the warm coffee mug. His knuckles were scarred, the skin thick and shiny in patches. He took a slow sip. "Good," he grunted. "Night shift brings out the roaches." She swallowed hard. He hasn't come back." The guy, Drake, didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead at the stainless steel coffee urns. "He won't." The absolute certainty in his voice sent a cold shiver down her spine, but it was a good kind of cold. It was the cold of a slammed door, the cold of a vault locking shut. She didn't want to know what Drake had said to him through that cracked window. She didn't want to know the mechanics of the threat. She just wanted the result. I never got to properly say thank you," she stammered, the words tumbling out of her mouth before her brain could stop them. "For what you did, for calling them, all of them." Drake slowly set the mug down. He let out a long, heavy exhale through his nose. He finally looked at her again. There was no warmth in his face, no paternal affection. "I didn't do it for you, kid," he said flatly. The words hit her like a physical slap, stinging her pride. "We don't run a charity, and we ain't the cops." He leaned forward slightly, resting his thick forearms on the counter. The smell of him, stale tobacco and old leather, drifted across the divide. "We got a clubhouse 5 miles down County 9, he said, his voice dropping into that terrifying low register. "We got a business to run. We don't like cops poking around our roads, creeps like that. They bring heat. They bring sirens. They make messes. You don't let a rat build a nest in your walls. You exterminate it before it draws attention." He leaned back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet attached to a heavy silver chain. He tossed a crumpled $10 bill onto the counter. It landed next to the 50-cent coffee. "Keep the change," he muttered. He stood up. The limp was more pronounced as he pushed himself off the stool. Chloe watched him walk towards the door. Her mind was reeling, a messy collision of bruised ego and profound relief. He had just stripped away the fairy tale. He hadn't been a knight in shining armor protecting the innocent maiden. He had been a landlord taking out the trash because it was stinking up his property. But as he reached for the heavy brass handle of the diner door, he paused. He didn't turn around, but his massive shoulders shifted slightly. "But for what it's worth," Drake rumbled, his back still facing her. "Nobody deserves to be hunted. Keep your head on a swivel, sweetheart." He pushed the door open. The bell chimed, and he was gone. She stood alone behind the counter, staring at the crumpled $10 bill. She reached out and touched it. The paper was rough and worn. She realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that his motive didn't matter. The why didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the reality of the outcome. The grey sedan was gone. She was standing in the sunlight, breathing the air, drinking the burnt coffee. She took the $10 bill, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. She never put it in the register. She never spent it. It's been 4 years since that night at the truck stop. Chloe doesn't work at the diner anymore. She finished her degree, moved to a different city, and got a job that requires her to stare at a computer screen in a climate-controlled office where the loudest noise is the hum of a laser printer. Her hands don't smell like bleach and fryer grease anymore. They smell like expensive hand lotion, She traded the dented Honda Civic in for a sensible crossover SUV with a rear-view camera and an automatic locking system that engages the second she puts the car in drive. But some things never entirely wash out of the fabric of who you are. Trauma isn't a loud, screaming thing. Not after the first few months. It becomes a quiet, domestic roommate. It lives in the corners of your routine. She still doesn't park next to large vans. She still locks her doors the absolute millisecond she sits in the driver's seat. If she's walking to her car and she sees someone sitting in their vehicle, idling in the dark, she turns around and walks back inside the building. She will wait an hour if she has to. Her friends call her paranoid. They make light-hearted jokes about her true crime obsession. She just smiles and nods. You can't explain the weight of the dark to someone who has never been hunted in it. You can't explain the specific, suffocating terror of a grey sedan pulling to the edge of a parking lot and just waiting. The man in the fleece never came back. She scoured the local police blotters for months after she left the diner, obsessively checking the mug shots, looking for his thinning hair and dead eyes. She never saw him. Sometimes she wonders what happened to him. She wonders if he just moved on to a different county, a different late-night diner, a different exhausted girl walking out to her car alone. That thought keeps her awake on the bad nights. The realization that the world is a massive, dark forest, and there are far more wolves out there than we want to admit. But on the good nights, she thinks about the other side of that coin. She thinks about the fact that monsters exist, yes. But sometimes, when the chips are down and the police are 20 miles away, the monsters have their own predators. She thinks about the sheer, unadulterated violence of 200 Harley-Davidsons breaking the silence of a dead county road. She thinks about the smell of hot leather and unburnt fuel. She thinks about the terrifying, perfect precision of the swarm boxing in that sedan, 3 rows deep, rendering a predator utterly and completely helpless. She never saw Drake again. She heard, through the grapevine of the diner's regulars before she left, that the club had moved their charter further upstate. They packed up their clubhouse and vanished, taking the thunder and the leather with them. They were outlaws. They were criminals. They operated by a code of violence and intimidation that she fundamentally disagrees with on every moral level. If she saw them in the news tomorrow, arrested for running guns or moving narcotics, she wouldn't be surprised. It is the great, uncomfortable contradiction of her life. She owes her absolute safety, and possibly her life, to a man who told her to her face that he only saved her because her death would have brought unwanted police attention to his drug routes. It shouldn't bring her comfort. It should horrify her. It should make her cynical and bitter about the nature of humanity. But it doesn't. Because when she's driving home late at night, and the road is dark, and her mind starts to play tricks on her, when every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror starts to look like a grey sedan slowly pacing her, she doesn't reach for her phone to call 911. She doesn't panic. Instead, she rolls down her window just a fraction of an inch. She lets the cold night air hit her face. And she listens. She listens past the hum of her own engine, past the wind rushing against the glass, past the quiet of the empty road. She listens for the deep, guttural thumping of a V-twin engine. She listens for the rumble of the swarm. It's never there, of course. It's just a ghost in the exhaust, but the memory of that roar is louder than the silence of the fear. It's a heavy, ironclad reminder that while the world is full of dark things waiting in the shadows, sometimes, if you're very lucky, the shadows bite back. If the reader felt the cold dread of that empty parking lot and the absolute thunder of 200 engines shifting the odds, they should hit that like button. The world is a dark, unpredictable place, and sometimes salvation doesn't wear a badge. It wears scuffed leather and rides a flat black Harley. Share this video to remind people that predators always underestimate the pack. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more raw, true-to-life dramas where the monsters hiding in plain sight finally meet their match. Drop a comment below. What would you have done when the grey sedan pulled up?